Thank you, Senator Warren. Senator Cotton, please.
Mr. Call, you testified to Senator Tillis that you were not yet sworn in when President Biden announced his decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. A few weeks ago in our closed session, you had dismissively told Senator Ernst that you were on your couch during that period. While you were on your couch, were you preparing for your confirmation hearing and then to take the office you now hold?
It was after my confirmation hearing, and I was preparing as best I could by reading the newspaper and open source materials. I was not in the Pentagon.
From the time you were nominated to the time you were confirmed, did you speak with National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan?
I don't believe so.
Never once?
No, I was under instruction not to do anything that would presume confirmation.
Okay. But you were following the news through open sources. At one point, did you become aware of President Biden's decision to withdraw all of our troops in Afghanistan by September 11th?
On April 14th.
When he announced it to the nation?
Yes, sir.
From your couch, what was your opinion on whether we should withdraw those troops or whether we should remain some residual troop presence in Afghanistan?
Well, I think as I said in my testimony during my confirmation hearing, I think it was an exchange with Senator Hawley. I was supportive of a conditions-based drawdown, conditioned most prominently on a peace agreement between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And
did President Biden's decision to withdraw all troops by September 11th comport with that conditions-based drawdown?
It did not.
Once you were confirmed, did you express a personal opinion similar to what this committee has heard from Secretary Austin and Generals Miller, McKenzie, and Milley that we should maintain a small residual troop presence in Afghanistan?
Well, by the time I came in office, the debate had moved on. The president had made his decision, and we were executing on that decision. I was involved in what our presence should look like at the U.S. Embassy and at the airport to make sure that we could safeguard the embassy, and I was involved in the oversight of the retrograde and neo-planning.
So you did or did not have a personal opinion on that matter?
My personal opinion never changed, but by the time I came into office, the president had made his decision, and we were moving out on that decision.
Did you agree that September 11th was an appropriate date by which to withdraw?
I have no insight into why that date was picked.
Since you've been confirmed, you've never once spoken to Secretary Austin or Jake Sullivan or anyone else in the administration about why September 11th was chosen?
I've not.
In retrospect, do you believe September 11th was a wise date by which to withdraw from Afghanistan?
I don't know.
The Biden administration has also said that there was no intelligence indicating that the Afghan National Army would collapse so quickly. Were you also surprised by the speed in which the Afghan security forces collapsed?
I think we were all surprised by the speed.
Are you aware that the intelligence from the intelligence community consistently shortened the timeline of their assessment of how long the Afghan government could survive from a matter of years at the end of last year to a matter of weeks at the end of July?
Yeah, in fact, by August, I think on the eve of the fall of Kabul, they were down to days to weeks. But yes, it went from years to months to years to weeks to months, and then to days to weeks.
General Miller has testified that in June there was a brief pause at the drawdown and ultimate closure at the Bagram Air Base to decide whether or not it should proceed. Obviously, it did proceed. Was it your opinion in late June, given the conditions you saw in Afghanistan, that the closure of Bagram Air Base should proceed?
It was General Miller's recommendation. My recollection is, the president, of course, had instructed the department to leave Afghanistan. So there was no scenario in which we were going to leave Afghanistan and not close Bagram Airfield. And the residual mission was at the embassy and at HKIA, which is where the concentration of the few hundred forces we would have left beyond August, that's where they would have been concentrated.
Okay. In 2011, Mr. Call, in your role as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, you stated the following: despite the often exaggerated media narrative that depicts Iraq on the verge of unraveling, the underlying security situation remains strong. Unfortunately, not long after that statement, Iraq was very much on the verge of unraveling. The Islamic State rose and rampaged across Syria and Iraq, and a third of Iraq collapsed, which necessitated a new counter-terrorist operation. You couldn't foresee the unraveling of Iraq. You didn't foresee the unraveling of Afghanistan. Are there any other countries that may be about to cause national security debacles for America that you think you are not foreseeing now?
I don't know. I've paid pretty close attention. I think we're focused on the counterterrorism front, on Somalia, the growth of violent extremists in places like the Sahel. We continue to have to be vigilant in Iraq and in Syria and in Yemen, and as we've talked about earlier in this hearing, in Afghanistan. And then, of course, there are even greater challenges when it comes to China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. So there's a lot that we have to focus on.
There are many challenges out there. Let's hope that we foresee them a little bit better than we have in the past.
Thank you, Senator Cotton. Senator Peters, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kaul, I'd like to start with Bangladesh and an ongoing wave of violence against minority Hindu temples and homes, which is just yet another reminder that disinformation spread on social media all too often results in real-world violence. Acts of terrorism like these are not only threaten innocent civilians, but also the political stability of an ally with whom we have a long history of cooperation on security, development, and humanitarian assistance, as well as disaster relief. So my question for you is, as you consider our strategic interest in a regional security context, how do you prioritize the information domain? And can U.S. security assistance in South and Central Asia enhance our allies' resilience to information warfare? And it's an issue that I've raised in this room many times with General Nakasone and Admiral Aquilino as well, but would love to hear your thoughts.
So, Senator, I agree with you that information and information operations envelop everything. They can enable our adversaries, or they can enable violent extremists, whether they be of one sect or religion or ethnicity. I think social media platforms don't do nearly enough to crack down on misinformation and disinformation along the lines that you suggested. I think that there are things that the Department of Defense can do to help our partners, especially in the cyber realm, and also to coordinate with them. We have instances in the past in the Counter ISIS campaign, for example, of coordinating to push back on propaganda and disinformation. But a lot of this will also fall outside of DoD's writ.
But still, the Department of Defense does play a pretty vital role. Obviously, if you can counter these activities, that ally becomes less vulnerable to external influence. We see the external influence from both the Chinese as well as the Russians. So you would acknowledge that piece of it needs to be something the Department of Defense is thinking about in particular.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Dr. Kaul, India's policies towards Afghanistan have been conceived largely through the lens of competition and proxy conflict with Pakistan. So it stands to reason that New Delhi should be no less concerned about the possibility that a Taliban government could benefit anti-Indian terrorist groups, especially those oriented towards Kashmir. In view of our commitment to joint cooperation and interoperability with this critical partner, and the fact that India is the only designated major defense partner of the United States, I believe it's important for us to understand how its view towards Afghanistan has and will evolve. So if you could please discuss this, but before you answer that question, I'm not asking you to speak for an ally, just for your thoughts or any insights that you have gained from co-chairing the U.S.-India Defense Policy Group earlier this month.
Yes, thank you. I've had a number of encounters, to include the one you just mentioned, with my Indian colleagues. I would say a couple of things. One, as I'm sure you're aware, they are concerned about the situation in Afghanistan. They're concerned about the intersection between instability there and their counterterrorism concerns. They want to work with us on those issues, sharing intelligence, cooperating where we can. But I would actually, Senator, I think in line with your question, I would zoom out. I think that there is a tremendous convergence between U.S. and Indian national interests right now that provides a lot of opportunity for us to cooperate with India, not just on Afghanistan and counterterrorism, but on broader regional security questions in the Indian Ocean and as it relates to the broader Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. General Mingus, prior to the Taliban's takeover, Russia bolstered its military and security posture in Central Asia. Regional military bases and the leadership of the Collective Security Treaty Organization make Russia the primary security guarantor against spillover from Afghanistan into Central Asia. So my question for you is, could this necessitate some kind of deconfliction mechanism for our over-the-horizon operations, similar to what we used in Syria?
Senator, I think we can probably go into a little bit more detail in the closed session, but the relationship with Russia, the Central Asian states, the nexus of our counterterrorist goals and objectives there are all intertwined, and we can go into more detail.
I'll look forward to that. Thank you, gentlemen, for your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Let me recognize Senator Kramer, and I'm going to depart for the vote, which is ongoing, and ask Senator King to recognize appropriately in my absence. Thank you. Senator Kramer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Inhofe. And thanks, gentlemen, for being here. As I've been listening to all of this, I'm struck by the fact that several people have referenced the miscalculation of things, whether it's the intelligence community, and, through the intelligence itself or analysis of intelligence or the communication of intelligence. It does seem like for the last 20 years or so, we've been miscalculating on the wrong side the capabilities for whether it's Afghanistan and Iraq to reconstitute, or ISIS or ISIS-K in Afghanistan. And I don't know what the answer is going forward, but management of expectations sometimes becomes part of the formula, I'm afraid. And I worry a little bit about that, you guys. And that is to say, and maybe I'll put it in the form of a question for you, Secretary Collin. This is just an honest, raw, almost spontaneous question. Do you feel, whether it's just a feeling or whether it's deliberate, do you get a sense of political pressure in your job to communicate something other than the worst news possible at any given moment? I know there's not a strategic advantage to that from a military standpoint, but politically, do you feel that as a political nominee?
I've never felt that personally, and I try to call it as I see it. But I do think it is true what you said at the outset, which is on a number of issues there's been, as it relates to Afghanistan, there's been serial miscalculation probably over 2 decades.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's obviously a lot of consequence to that. And like I said, we can have a longer talk sometime about how to do that better, obviously. I'm going to just get to one point related to the miscalculation of ISIS-K and maybe talk about what we do know, or what you might know, if we can talk about it here and if not later in the closed session. I mean, how financially healed is ISIS-K? And as part of the calculation, obviously, that's a big part of it. How well off are they financially, do you think?
No, I don't have a precise number of what's in the bank. I don't think they are nearly as well resourced as ISIS in Iraq and Syria were back at the heyday. Think the kind of 2014, 2015 timeframe when ISIS controlled all those oil wells and had $1 billion of annual revenue. It's nothing like that. I think for the moment, ISIS-K is mostly focused on creating havoc within Afghanistan. But they do have a cadre of a few thousand folks, some of which would love to conduct external attacks. ISIS-K is obviously linked to the broader ISIS network globally. And so I think we have to be vigilant that a subset of ISIS-K could develop the resources and the capability to strike outward toward the U.S. homeland. And as General Mingus said, we have to be poised to disrupt that so that that never comes to pass. So
regarding your statement about raise havoc within, obviously that can be part of the strategy to access generosity and acquire both financial resources and recruitment resources. I mean, how do you sense that's going for them?
I've not seen a lot of evidence that they've, going back to the Iraq example, ISIS was able to knock off a bank in Mosul and seize hundreds of millions of dollars of Iraqi money. There's been no version of that that I'm aware of. I also think that the Taliban is pretty committed to going after ISIS-K. I don't think there's a willpower question there. Taliban capability to be determined, but they're pretty intent on doing it. So I've not seen huge gains by ISIS-K. We have seen them carry out some horrific bombings against minority populations inside Afghanistan. I think we should expect that some of that will continue. But from a U.S. national interest perspective, we have to be particularly focused on the subset of the threat streams that could emanate outward towards us.
Do you worry about all of this, again, raising havoc, as you put it, and what you've just described, is inspiring to others, whether it's, again, it could be Al-Qaeda for that matter as well, but whether it's financial resources or recruitment?
I do think that that's something we have to watch. I think the Taliban is not keen for a lot of Arab foreign fighters and others to flow into Afghanistan, frankly, for either Al-Qaeda or ISIS-K. I do think we have to look about how events in Afghanistan or anywhere else in the world, could be Nigeria, could be Somalia, could be Yemen, could be Syria, can have a galvanizing effect on the internet and elsewhere that inspires recruits. And I know that the Department of Homeland Security and our intelligence community is pretty focused on that.
General, anything you'd add to any of that?
If you look at kind of how we parse a violent extremist organization out and how you analyze our ensuing level efforts, the threat itself, whether it's internally, externally focused, does it have host nation capacity that can interdict that, the will and the intent and the capacity and the capability. Right now, as Dr. Call pointed out, they're internally focused, and the capacity and capability to be externally focused is still limited. Our efforts in the months going ahead, and as we continue to improve our over-the-horizon architecture, is to ensure that that external capability never comes to fruition.
Thank you both. Thank you.
On behalf of the chair, Senator Rosen via WebEx.
Well, thank you, Senator King. Appreciate that. Of course, Ranking Member Inhofe as well for convening this critically important hearing on security in Afghanistan. I also want to once again thank our troops who served our nation there for nearly 20 years, and of course, their families who love them and serve alongside with them. As we look ahead to the future of security in South and Central Asia, we must also take stock of how we got to this point. We have 20 years of decisions in Afghanistan to evaluate, plenty of responsibility to go around, particularly to the prior administration, which sets us on the path to capitulation to the Taliban. Nonetheless, it remains frustrating and shameful that over the past few months, despite our efforts to save lives and bring vulnerable individuals to freedom, we have failed so many. For this, the American people deserve accountability, and they demand answers. Like others on this committee, I'm also concerned about the regional implications of our withdrawal on security, counterterrorism, and American interests. So I'd like to follow up on some of the questions I asked Secretary Austin last month, but which he didn't have time to answer at that moment. So about our ability to combat terrorism in the region, now that we no longer have a boots on the ground presence in Afghanistan. So to both of you, Secretary Call and General Mingus, what's our plan for executing an enduring counterterrorism strategy that will be able to fully address and counter the influence of the violent extremist organizations that everyone's talking about in Afghanistan? And how has this changed now that our Afghan partners are no longer in control of the country? I guess we can start, General, we can start with you.
Yes, ma'am. First, I would start with no two of these organizations are the same. Each one of them has to be looked at independently. And in those variables that I talked about, what's the ensuing level of U.S. effort to ensure that you continue to disrupt and degrade so they don't pose a threat either to partners or our U.S., our homeland? We look at from my perspective on the military side, the resources necessary to be able to prosecute and continue to disrupt and degrade. And we move those based on recommendations that come up from the combatant commanders through the chairman to the Secretary of Defense to ensure that from an authorities and a resourcing standpoint, we're postured to be able to do that. In this session, before we go to close, I can say that we continue to routinely conduct operations in Syria, in Iraq, and other places where these threats are emanating to make sure that they're not there. In terms of Afghanistan, we continue to mature that, but we're going to talk in a few minutes in terms of what the specific assets that are applied to that. And Dr. Call, I'll defer to him in terms of his thoughts on the broader strategy for violent extremist organizations.
Thank you.
I think in Afghanistan, as it relates to the problem set there, you need to think of it in terms of layers. So ideally, you would have partners on the ground. That doesn't happen. That's not the case in Afghanistan. This isn't the first time where that's been the case. Libya is a good example of where we were able to knock ISIS back pretty hard in Libya in the kind of 2019 time frame without boots on the ground, and we can talk about that more in the closed session. But as it relates to Afghanistan, we have these assets in the Gulf that we're projecting ISR into. We have national technical means, SIGINT, imagery, et cetera, that gives us insight into these organizations. We are sharing intelligence with regional actors and international partners who share our counterterrorism objectives. We're seeking to build out a more robust ecosystem for over-the-horizon CT, which would include regional players. We've in conversations with Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and others, and again, we can talk about more in the closed session. I also think to Senator Peters' point, we also need to think that this isn't just what we're doing on the ground in these places, but what we're doing in the cyber realm to disrupt their activities, their finances, what we're doing through sanctions, what we're doing through information operations. There's a lot that isn't kinetic.
Well, I want to kind of build on that, Secretary. How do you assess the collapse of the Afghan government, the effect on ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria? Do you think Afghanistan's going to see a surge of foreign fighters coming in?
I think it's possible, and we need to be vigilant against that possibility. My read, at least, of based on the intelligence community's assessment, is that the Taliban is not keen to see a large number of Arab foreign fighters in particular come in to Afghanistan to kind of repopulate either ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda. In particular, ISIS-K, because as I mentioned earlier, the Taliban and ISIS-K are mortal enemies.
Thank you. I see that my time's just about expired, so I will yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Now let me recognize Senator Sullivan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I want to talk the issue of Taiwan and our policy there. Mr. Secretary, 20 years ago, President Bush had said in an interview that the full force of the U.S. military would come and defend Taiwan. A prominent U.S. senator in an op-ed was very critical. He said, in this case, President Bush's inattention to detail has damaged the U.S. credibility with our allies, sown confusion throughout the Pacific Rim. Words matter, this prominent senator said. Of course, that was Senator Biden last week or 2 weeks ago. His words have dramatically sown confusion on this very sensitive issue. I was just out in the Indo-PACOM region. Men and women in the military are doing a great job preparing for contingencies, military contingencies. But the president said, we're going to defend Taiwan publicly. Is that our new policy?
The White House clarified that the president wasn't trying to establish new policy. I think the policy remains that it was established under the Taiwan Relations Act.
So the president's statement was incorrect?
I will defer to the White House.
Well, you're the Secretary of Defense for policy, so.
From the White House, the view is that our policy remains that under the Taiwan Relations Act, which is that we are prepared to ensure that Taiwan can defend itself and that we also have the capabilities to deter and prevent coercion across the strait.
So do you agree with President Biden 20 years ago when he criticized President Bush, saying that his statement and his inattention to detail, words matter, has damaged U.S. credibility with our allies and sown confusion throughout the Pacific Rim?
I see no evidence that our allies are confused about our resolve on Taiwan or China or anything else. I've engaged with our Indo-Pacific allies and partners repeatedly. They know that the department and the U.S. government treats China as the pacing challenge, that Taiwan is the pacing scenario. We are doing everything to get after that.
Let me talk about that. This is our budget relative to China's budget. When National Democrats get into office, unfortunately, they cut defense spending. You see the blue is our cuts during the Obama years. The blue up there is the increase that Republicans and the Trump administration put to our budget. But one thing's certain, China keeps spending 10, 14% increases in GDP growth. Can I see the next slide? So the one issue I keep hearing about with our allies is this: the prioritization of our military. If you look at the Biden budget, $6 trillion budget, the two agencies that they actually cut, they're proposing to cut, is DOD and Homeland Security. Those are cuts. That's your budget. That's what matters to the Chinese and our allies more than anything. That's President Biden's budget, that's Bernie Sanders' budget, that's Senator Schumer's budget. But something happened recently, Mr. Secretary. This committee and the House committee rebuked that pretty dramatically, the budgets that we have put forward in the NDAA, in the House version of the NDAA, increases defense spending by a real increase of 3%. That would be moving from about $715 billion to $740 billion. Does the department now agree with what, in a very bipartisan way, this committee and the House Armed Services Committee said, we shouldn't do that? That's a bad message to the Chinese. Do you agree with what we did here on this committee? Are you going to change your budget submission?
It's obviously within Congress's prerogative to do exactly what you did. I would just say from the department's perspective, China is the #1 pacing challenge. The Secretary of Defense has been laser focused on it. Our budget,
But do you,
our
I'm
budget was
asking,
oriented around it.
do you agree
We
with
should-
it? Do you agree with this? Do you agree with what we did in the committee? I know it's our prerogative, of course. I'm asking your opinion.
I agree that we should be spending significant resources to get after China as the pacing challenge.
General, what about you? I know it's a difficult issue because you have to support the president's budget. I know that the members of the uniformed military don't support it, but they have to constitutionally, I get that. But in your personal opinion, would you rather have the House and the Senate's $740 billion top line or the Biden administration's $715 billion top line?
My personal opinion is yes, given the modernization bills and the force design and force structure challenges that we're going to have in the future. I agree.
With the 740?
Predictable, sustainable is the most important to the Department of Defense. But when you look at the modernization bills that are coming forward in the coming years, the 740 is a better number than what was proposed, in my personal opinion.
Thank you, General, for your honesty on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sullivan. Now let me recognize via WebEx Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your support of the Afghan Study Commission proposal I've drafted with the backing of a number of my colleagues who are sitting here today. I'm also looking forward to authorizing my Afghan Study Commission as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I'm further pleased to hear our witnesses confirm their support for an independent commission because this is just too important to get wrong. If we set too narrow a scope, we will fail to understand the true causes of our failures, or worse, we will learn the wrong lessons. If we don't look at the role of all government agencies involved and only look at DoD, we will similarly miss important conclusions. If we simply settle for yet another report without empowering a truly nonpartisan, independent body to make forward-looking recommendations, then we won't have done our duty to prevent future generations from repeating past mistakes. And if we don't resource the commission appropriately, or if we rush the commission's work because we want to look like we're taking action, but we don't really want to commit to doing the work thoroughly, then we'll have wasted everyone's time. After listening to today's hearing, I'm even more convinced we need a nonpartisan, independent commission to examine the entire scope of the war in Afghanistan. General Minkus, thank you for expressing your support for an independent commission to study the entire span of the war in Afghanistan. Can you please elaborate on why existing lessons learned exercises are not sufficient, and what further lessons could be examined by an independent commission looking across government agencies? How would this benefit future strategic planners and policymakers?
Thank you, ma'am. I think, and you alluded to much of this, when you look at, and Chairman Milley shared some of these a couple of weeks ago, but just from the mission sets. We started off with a counterterrorism mission, which moved into a stability mission, which moved into a nation-building mission. We invaded Iraq 2 years into the operations in Afghanistan. We never dealt with the sanctuary in Pakistan adequately. Corruption has been discussed several times. The legitimacy, how we mirror image both the government and the Afghan National Security Forces. We didn't understand the culture as well as we should have. The will, that component of it as well. But when you take all those, and there's several that I'm omitting, that is much larger than just a DoD or interagency thing. It's got to be a whole of government approach, and so as many elements that we can look at this independently will always be good for the nation going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Cowell, thank you as well for your statement of support. Before you were confirmed, much of your recent work focused on analysis of American grand strategy post 9/11. So I know you've been thinking about many different agencies that shape our national security. Did the failures in Afghanistan result from the actions of the DoD alone, or did the actions of the Department of State, the intelligence community, and multiple Congresses and administrations also impact the eventual outcome in Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's important to have a scope and scale that matches the actual war. So it needs to look holistically at 20 years. It shouldn't just look at the DoD involvement, but the interagency involvement, what we were doing diplomatically, from an economic and development perspective, from an intelligence and counterterrorism perspective, to include those pieces that are outside of DoD's lane. But frankly, I think it also is an opportunity, Senator, to explore the mentality, the overall approach to foreign policy that we had after 9/11 and how that really manifested in 20 years in Afghanistan.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask you the same question I just asked General Mingus. How could this work of such a broad committee of an independent commission benefit future strategic planners and policymakers? You just mentioned that we understand the mentality of what happened post 9/11, and as we were making these decisions, how could the lessons learned from this type of a committee of an independent commission benefit future strategic planners and policymakers?
Well, I think it's crucial because it's really a major opportunity to take a holistic view. The Department of Defense will do various reviews with different timeframes, but inevitably we'll be looking through our soda straw. Now, it's a big soda straw, but it's a soda straw. State Department will do the same. The intelligence community will do the same. The NSC might even pull all those threads together, but at the end of the day, there's a wider context. And I really think the opportunity to make this bipartisan and to make it independent and to have the scope and scale be appropriate will have tremendous value.
Ma'am, very
Thank
quickly,
you.
the other thing that I would add that needs to be a part of this, when you look at the vast nature of the NATO and coalition component of it, there has to be a partner and coalition aspect to that commission.
Important point.
Very good point, General. I agree with you because we certainly expected our partners to do a little bit more, and they were not as able to help maintain Afghanistan as we had hoped. So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for your testimony today. Bottom line, for 20 years, we prosecuted this war without a viable strategy. We failed to consider long-term costs and consequences, and if we fail to learn from our history in Afghanistan, we will be doomed to repeat it. I urge my colleagues to join me and pass my Afghanistan War Commission Act. We owe it to our constituents, we owe it to the veterans that served honorably and the families that lost loved ones, and we owe it to future generations of American service members. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Duckworth. Let me recognize Senator Scott, please.
Thank you, Chairman Reed. Chair Mingus, given that the President committed to evacuate all Americans before our military would leave, would you say a successful evacuation would have included all Americans being evacuated before our troops left?
Defining success is hard, and I know this has been talked about and debated, and what the President said, what the decision and what the recommendation by the military to leave on the, but historically, we've gone back and we've looked, and I'm not even sure that there is an example of where we've done a NEO where we brought all the American citizens out of a given country. And so given the remote nature of Afghanistan and the various locations that the American citizens, I'm not even sure it's a reasonable expectation that we could have got 100% out before the 31st.
But the President did commit that we were going to get all of the American citizens out before we would remove troops. Do you think it should be the policy of the United States that we will remove U.S. military and its assets from a hostile country with enemy forces bearing down on us before we evacuate American citizens and partners in the future?
I think it would be hard to quantify a hypothetical because there were so many variables in this one, and no future NEO scenario will be identical. So the decision and the recommendation by the Joint Chiefs and the Chairman to depart on the 31st took into account the situation on the ground for this particular situation, and it was deemed that the calculus was actually, and the risk to American citizens was actually higher had we stayed beyond the 31st than we did when we left actually on the 31st, to include the risk to our troopers that were on the ground at HKIA.
If you were American citizens and you listened to the President say that our troops would not leave before all American citizens were evacuated, would you feel like our president and our military let them down?
There may be some that have that view, but I think our commitment to continue to bring American citizens out has been important.
So I assume the military leadership understood the risk of removing the military and its assets before evacuating American civilians and our partners. Did you see the analysis, and did you warn the administration of the risk of bringing out troops and our equipment before all Americans were evacuated?
Did we provide that risk?
Did you warn the administration that if we did it the way it ended up happening, where we brought troops out first before everybody was evacuated, and the fact that we could have evacuated people earlier and we didn't, did you warn the administration that the path they were going down was put American citizens at risk?
I know, and I was not present for those conversations, and I was not with the chairman when he made those recommendations to the president, but I do know that he went prepared even before the Neoport, but the decision to come out in April, I know that he was prepared and armed to provide the risk associated with the withdrawal.
Did the State Department or the Pentagon choose to rely on the Taliban for security at the airport as we withdrew?
They were a part of that security ecosystem.
Who made the decision, state or the Pentagon?
If memory serves, it was a combination of the commanders on the ground up through the chain of command.
So the commanders on the ground made the decision that the Taliban would do the security, knowing the Taliban's history?
It was deemed that it had to be a relationship that we had to work through, and whether they had stayed on the outside of Kabul or on the outskirts of HKIA, once the collapse occurred and the NSF folded, that was the outer perimeter. That was the outer security for forces that were outside where we were at.
Was the president warned about the risk of relying on the Taliban for security around the airport?
I'm not aware whether he was informed of that or not.
Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott. Now let me recognize Senator Blumenthal, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your continuing attention to these issues and having this hearing today. Gentlemen, last week I had the opportunity to visit Quantico Camp Upshur. As of the date of my visit, Camp Upshur housed 4,410 Afghan men, women, children who were able to escape Afghanistan. The camp has a maximum capacity of about 5,000 people, a number that it will probably soon reach. I want to, first of all, commend the extraordinary work done by the United States Marine Corps at Quantico and their partners from other military branches, as well as the civilians from the State Department, CDC, and others. But during our briefings there, we had the opportunity not only to meet those Marines who were hosting these Afghan guests, they called them guests, quite correctly, but also representatives of the civilian agencies charged with their resettlement. And we were fortunate to speak with the people housed at Camp Upshur, the refugees who have escaped and who have managed to avoid the torture, death that is threatened to many who remain there. I met with a family of 5 that were able to escape on charter flights from Mazar-e Sharif. They left after withdrawal had been completed, our withdrawal of our military. These were flights that my office was involved in facilitating. So I was just incredibly moved to meet with this family. It happened by coincidence that this family was chosen to meet with me. They were the beneficiaries of the charter flights that my office worked day and night to facilitate. Sadly, more members of their very family are hiding and seeking assistance so they can leave Afghanistan, literally brothers and other family members who are in grave danger. More needs to be done, in short, to help these people escape and to keep faith with them. After my visit to Camp Upshur, I have still significant concerns about the pace of resettlement. We were tragically slow in planning the execution of the evacuation mission, the airlift of 120,000 people that was accomplished, even though many, many remain. We cannot, again, rely on optimistic expectations. We must plan for reality and be ready for the worst case situations. We were told that the Afghans brought to Camp Upshur would be departing for resettlement in 3 to 4 weeks. I don't believe that number can possibly be accurate, 3 to 4 weeks. When I visited, there had already been 52 births, a joyous occasion, for sure, but one that prevents not only the mother and child from being able to travel and be resettled, but the entire family unit. That's just an example of the impediments to resettlement. And I think we need to focus on the fact that the pace of resettlement very simply is not keeping up with the pace of new arrivals. As these locations reach maximum capacity, we face a looming crisis. The processing of our Afghan guests is completed quickly, 1 or 2 days for intake. At that point, they await resettlement opportunities. Currently, the weather's good. It's the fall, and a temperate one at that. But it will change. And even with the heating in those tents, life will become more and more difficult. The tents and other expeditionary structures used for housing and feeding people do not currently afford the kind of heat that is necessary. If the temperature drops, this inevitability may force closing of the tents at Pioneer City, which currently houses approximately 1,000 individuals. So before my time expires, I just want to close by saying we face 75 to 80,000 seeking resettlement of those Afghan refugees, a total of 120,000 evacuated. We have failed to provide the resources so far that will enable effective resettlement. It is a looming crisis, and I'm going to ask for your response in writing, since my time has expired, as to how medical care, housing, and other services will be provided at the camps and what will be done to ensure more expeditious resettlement. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Blackburn, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Undersecretary Call, you're going to recognize my questions because I asked them in the hearing in September and you didn't want to answer them then. So let's take another round, another go at it. So as either the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy or in the time between President Biden's inauguration and your confirmation, did you ever have a conversation with General Scott Miller about the future of Afghanistan?
No.
You did not. Okay. During your September testimony on the topic, you told Senator Ernst that you basically didn't have an opportunity to participate in the decision process on Afghanistan because you were at home sitting on your couch. We're all aware that you were pending confirmation prior to late April, but were you actually at home sitting on the couch, or were you involved in the president's decision calculus on when and how to withdraw from Afghanistan?
I had no interactions with the administration because I was trying not to presume confirmation.
Okay. Were you ever part of a rock walk in which General Miller was in the room?
Yeah, the rock drill happened on May 8th, about a week after I took office.
So you were present for that May rock walk?
The rock drill on the retrograde, I was.
Okay, thank you. What we're concerned about, and what I hear from Tennesseans about, is that you all have a tendency to point the finger at the Trump administration, say they didn't know how to lead, but you've taken over and what you've done is to fail to lead. And the DOD leadership is something that people in Tennessee have a lot of concern about. They are seeing apathy, they're perceiving apathy, and they are perceiving a self-righteous indignation that the individuals or the military would question you all. So in this vein, I want to read for you portions of a letter that I received in my office this week. And I'm reading from the letter. Thank you for your work in trying to find answers about the horrible Afghanistan withdrawal. I saw a news report yesterday that the suicide bomber who took my son's life and 12 others was actually a prisoner at Bagram. So then, not only did we leave all of our military equipment, but we also just left these terrorist prisoners in Bagram. And now we find out that the Taliban just released them, which is not a surprise. I have not expressed my anger or political thoughts through this grieving time, but now I hear that this coward had been locked up and someone on our side made the decision to just let these bad guys evaporate into the wind. It really frustrates me beyond belief. Please continue to try to find out who is responsible for the decision to run from Bagram. It sounds like that decision is directly related to the death of my son and the 12 other U.S. service members. Now, I am duty-bound to my constituents, to Tennesseans, and to these military families from our state who have reached out to me about this horrific debacle in Afghanistan. So I need to ask you a few questions, and please bear in mind that you are not speaking to me, that you are speaking to them. So let's throttle any animosity that you have toward me and speak to the Tennesseans, to our service members that want these answers. Who specifically is responsible for the decision to withdraw U.S. forces from Bagram Airfield?
When the president decided that we would withdraw from Afghanistan, we were always going to leave Bagram as a consequence of leaving Afghanistan.
So it was the president's decision?
The president directed that we leave Afghanistan, and then General Miller executed a retrograde that included the leaving Bagram Airfield.
Okay, so the president. Who specifically is responsible for the decision to leave terrorist prisoners in Bagram despite the impending advance of the Taliban forces?
So Parwan Prison, which is the prison you're speaking of, isn't actually at the airfield. It's off the airfield, and it was transferred to the Afghans in 2013. So it wasn't part of the retrograde to transfer that prison. It had been transferred 8 years prior.
Okay. So you're saying that leaving Bagram had absolutely no impact at all on the prisoners being freed. Is that the position of this administration, that you had nothing to do with this?
I mean, I think people of good character and good judgment can disagree. I think that the Afghan National Security Forces had control of the prison, and they were handed control of Bagram Airfield. So when the Taliban overran those forces, they took over both the airfield and the prison.
Yes. So that was a decision made by the president to give up Bagram Airfield and to execute a speedy withdrawal from Afghanistan.
The decision was to leave Afghanistan, which means we were going to leave Bagram, and General Miller's retrograde plan included leaving Bagram.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Kelly, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Call, countries like China have long benefited from our presence in Afghanistan and the stability that we provided in the region. The conclusion of U.S.-led operations has forced countries in the region to reassess their policies towards Afghanistan. And nations, including China and Russia, are developing closer relationships with the Taliban. China, in particular, has sought to call attention to aid donations and pushed the UN to lift sanctions without asking much accountability from the Taliban. So, Secretary Call, how would you assess China's intentions and priorities with respect to Afghanistan, and what concerns do you have for how these could impact U.S. interests?
They're important questions. I think China's actually quite worried at the moment. They did benefit from our presence in Afghanistan, despite the fact that they rail against our military interventions across the world. They're worried about growing instability on their border, because remember, China does share a narrow border with Afghanistan. They're also, frankly, worried that our withdrawal from Afghanistan will allow us to refocus elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific in checking back the challenge that they present. We know that. You are absolutely right that China is trying to influence events in Afghanistan largely through economic levers. They're not able to do that unilaterally because of UN sanctions. It's the policy of the Biden administration not to recognize the Taliban government or to lift those sanctions unless a bunch of conditions are met that the Taliban currently aren't meeting.
And how should U.S. policy towards Afghanistan and China's activities there fit into the broader context of our strategic competition with China?
Well, I think we do have to be mindful of competing with China in a lot of places. I would not put Afghanistan at the top of that list. I think first and foremost, we have to focus on the Western Pacific and on places like the Indian Ocean. There are also places in Africa and elsewhere where the Chinese are seeking to turn dual-use facilities into military bases and other things. So I think we should have an eye on what China is doing in Afghanistan, but I would not make it the focal point of my strategy in checking back Beijing's aspirations.
All right, well, thank you. General Mingus, the U.S. military relationship with our allies in South and Central Asia is critical to regional stability and our national security, and many of these relationships are strengthened through our continued commitment to joint exercises and training. And these activities can also serve as a deterrent to regional aggression. We have continued to see Russia-led exercises with regional actors, including a joint military exercise near the northern Afghanistan border with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan this summer. Similarly, China and Tajikistan conducted a joint. From an operational standpoint, are we doing enough militarily to train, equip, and prepare our South and Central Asia partners?
Senator, thank you. And that's one of the things that Dr. Call has kind of alluded to that we'd like to talk about in the closed session in terms of the recent trips that was just made in terms of the outcomes of that. But we are looking
ISIS, including the recent attack on worshipers in Kunduz. At the same time, they've tried to play up their own efforts to counter ISIS, pointing to several arrests and suggesting that they've averted ISIS plans. What can we learn from the fact that the Taliban is more interested in putting a positive spin on its ability to govern than they are in working to address known threats to both Afghan and international security?
Yes, Senator. First of all, I don't think we should trust the Taliban, whatever they say. I think we have to watch what they do. I think the only thing we can have any confidence or faith in is that they will try to advance their own narrow interests. I think as it relates to the ISIS-K problem set, they do not have an interest in ISIS-K establishing a beachhead in Afghanistan, either to destabilize Afghanistan or to conduct external operations. So I actually believe that the Taliban is highly motivated to go after ISIS-K. Their ability to do so, I think, is to be determined.
Have we seen any success? Is there any intel that you could talk about that shows any success with them going after ISIS-K?
So I think we have seen instances of them going after ISIS-K. During the war, of course, there were ferocious battles at times between the Taliban and ISIS-K as well. But I do want to keep in mind for this committee that as it relates to the threat streams that we're most focused on from ISIS-K, it's the ones that might be externally projected out from Afghanistan. We have not seen those threat streams yet materialize, and we would not count on the Taliban to be the ones responsible for disrupting that. We will have our own unilateral capabilities to do that.
And what can we do right now to contain that threat?
Well, I think we should continue to engage the Taliban on these questions. We did have a delegation in Doha a couple of weeks ago, high-level delegation, to hold the Taliban accountable for their commitments under the February 2020 Doha Agreement to not allow Afghanistan to be a safe haven for international terrorism. The Taliban tell us that they remain committed to that, but like I said, it's not just their words that matter, it's going to be their actions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Call, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Hawley, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Call, I understand that on August the 18th, the Consul General in Kabul sent the following email to his team. I'm going to quote it for you. Quoting now, President Biden phoned Ambassador Wilson with the following directive about who to clear to board the evacuation flights. Number one, anyone with a valid form of ID should be given permission to go on a plane if that person plausibly falls into the categories we will evacuate. U.S. citizens and LPRs plus their immediate families, LES plus their immediate families, those entitled to an SIV, and Afghans at risk. Number two, families, including women and children, should be allowed through and held to fill out the planes. Number three, total inflow to the United States must exceed the number of seats available, err on the side of excess. I'm still quoting, this guidance provides clear discretion and direction to fill seats and provides special consideration for women and children when we have seats. I expect that C-17 flight volume will increase, end quote. Are you aware of any guidance from the White House to evacuate Afghans who might plausibly fill out these categories, to fill seats regardless of whether the passengers actually were eligible or not, and to err on the side of excess? Are you familiar with this directive?
So our priorities, so I can't speak to that specific engagement, but our priorities in that time frame were, as you mentioned, first and foremost, American citizens and legal permanent residents, green card holders, also locally employed staff of the State Department, but also other agencies and departments, SIVs, and others with documents. But it was also the case that as we were bringing forces in, we had excess capacity to bring people out. And so what the president was signaling was, if there are other clearly Afghans at risk that we can safely bring into the airport and get off the airfield, we should do that.
Well, but that's not what the email says. The email doesn't say clearly. It says plausibly. It says that the flights need to be filled out. It says that we need to err on the side of excess. I mean, what I'm driving at is we now know that we've got major problems with vetting of the people who were brought to this country, who were evacuated and brought to this country. This email seems to indicate that the administration was saying, just fill up the planes. I mean, if they plausibly fall into a category, put them on a plane. Is that wrong? Is that incorrect?
So vetting was always foremost in our mind, but just keep in mind, Senator, the vetting wasn't happening at HKIA.
Where did the vetting happen?
So all the vetting happened at what we called the lily pads. So these were...
And the vetting consisted of what?
Yeah. So in places like Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Ramstein, and elsewhere, essentially teams of DHS, CBP, DOD would collect biometric information, fingerprints, et cetera, biographic information, and then that information would be fed through the NCTC, CBP, and FBI databases. And only people who had cleared that vetting so that they didn't have contacts with the Taliban or the Haqqanis or Al-Qaeda or ISIS were to be manifested to be brought to the United States. And people who required further processing were not brought to the United States.
Was there ever any in-person vetting done?
Well, all this was in person in the lily pad.
Well, those aren't interviews. That's a scan. That's just fingerprinting. So, were there ever any in-person? That's a screening. Was there actually any vetting done where you sit down and you ask the person questions?
So, it's a good question. For those where there was either there wasn't sufficient information or there was derogatory information. Now keep in mind, the derogatory information could be that you shared the same name with somebody, or that your phone number touched a phone number of a phone number. For people where there was any derogatory information, then yes, follow-up interviews and additional vetting was done.
At the lily pads?
Yes.
And in the United States too, or just at the lily pads?
There may have been instances in which people came to the United States who also received additional vetting, but I would direct you to the DHS to get the full counting of that.
Oh, I'm talking to DHS, believe me. And what's interesting is what DHS says is there was never any in-person vetting done anywhere. Not at the lily pads, not in the United States. Your testimony here today under oath is there was in-person vetting done, that you sat down and did interviews with them. Is that right? I just want to be clear on this.
So my understanding is that at the lily pads, so forward,
Right.
Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, et cetera, that those who popped derogatory information, if they couldn't be cleared because it was some misunderstanding, so for the example of someone with the same name,
Right.
if it required further investigation, there were times where the FBI spoke to those individuals.
So you testified in September that those evacuated are about 6,000 American citizens. You testified in September that the SIVs were about 1,200 or 1,300. That leaves 116,700 people based on the 124,000 NEO number that you've been offering. 116,700 people who were not citizens, who were not SIVs, and we just don't know much about. Who were those people?
Yeah. So just so we all are working off the same set of numbers. So we evacuated around 2,000 U.S. Embassy personnel. We evacuated 5,530 American citizens. We evacuated 3,335 third country nationals. So think of that as, you know, somebody who worked for another embassy, not an Afghan. We evacuated during the NEO 2,496 SIV holders. And then we evacuated 64,052 other Afghans at risk. Some of those were on our P2 or P1 or P2 refugee rolls, and others were, you know, some of those were, I know every office on Capitol Hill was calling to try to get people out, whether they had a formal relationship or not. It might have been because they had a relationship with an organization like NDI or, you know, some other NGO. We also got out 2,004 NATO citizens, and we facilitated 44,874 people coming out on non-U.S. aircraft by other folks. So it's a mixed mash of a lot of different categories. About 84% of the people we brought out were Afghans at risk of various kinds, SIVs, P1s, P2s, or others.
My time has expired, and the chairman's been very indulgent. I'll have a number of questions for you for the record.
Take those for the record.
Dr. Call, there's a lot to sort through here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Tuberville, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. Thanks for being here today. I know it's been a long day. Dr. Call, I want to talk a little bit about the Doha Agreement and the timeline. I would think that you would say there was probably around 4 main parts of the Doha Agreement. One was being a ceasefire permanent and comprehensive. Another condition was withdrawal of American troops, April 12th, as President Biden said, September the 11th. We've talked about that. How long was it before the Taliban violated the terms of the Doha Agreement, in your mind?
I think as General Mingus has already testified, from the very beginning, the only part of the agreement they stuck with was not attacking U.S. forces. The rest of the agreement they did not stick with.
Right. May the 1st, you know, they did some damage, obviously, over in Afghanistan. Now, you were in your seat April 27th. Given the Taliban broke their end of the deal so quickly, did you change your policy assessment on May the 1st?
Well, by the time I came into office, the decision had already been made. So
yeah, but did you change? Did you have a change?
My position, which I testified to during my confirmation, was that we should have a conditions-based withdrawal. My personal position never changed, but by the time I came into office, the president had already made his decision, and that wasn't going to be relitigated.
But in the first full month, they kept breaking their promises, and I got a couple of slides here I just want to show you. Okay. Did things get better on your second month? You know, in June, the Taliban, they captured 69 districts in June, and it was starting to ramp up. Not only did they capture 69 districts, but that month the Taliban captured 700 trucks, Humvees, dozens of vehicles, and all that kind of stuff. Did you rethink your policy at that time, given how badly it was ramping up? Did you give your preference upstream, so to speak, to the people that were needed to listen?
So you are right that the security situation deteriorated in June. It got worse in July, and obviously it got catastrophically worse in August. We were focused on executing the retrograde because that was the direction from the President of the United States.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to July. How many districts did the Taliban capture in July? You remember? I got it.
Not off the top of my head, but I have no reason to
I'll give it
disbelieve
for you. 64. Okay, 64.
map behind you.
Yeah. President said on July the 8th, quote, "I am briefed daily on the battlefield updates," end quote. So President Biden knew how badly it was going. It was ramping up in Afghanistan, and yet we gave up Bagram Airfield that month, correct?
General Miller's plan was to, for the retrograde, called for us to give up Bagram in early July.
Right, right. By the end of the third month on the job, the Taliban had entered the capitals of Helmand and Herat, and they controlled 223 districts. Dr. Call, you know how many districts there are in Afghanistan?
Well, by that time, it must have been more than half the districts in the country.
So there's 407 total, and there's 223 districts that they had overtaken. So let's talk about the fourth month on the job. August, after 3 straight months of losses and bloodshed, did the OSD policy suggest change in course, how bad it was getting?
The president had directed that we leave Afghanistan. There was no set of deliberations
was there any
about
talk back and forth?
So there were conversations about whether we should position forces to provide more close air support, and we did that in the July-August timeframe. We put a couple hundred of additional forces into HKIA to do personnel recovery and other things so we could do more airstrikes. But the course of the policy was set in April, and we carried out that policy.
But in August, it got worse, and the fighting was ramping up. To recap, in 3.5 months that you were there, due to this administration's, I guess we can call it incompetence, we saw a complete collapse of Afghanistan in that short period of time. Wasting 20 years of blood and treasure. Since President Biden took office, America, to me, is less safe. Our allies are less safe, and we once again have to confront radical Islamic terrorism somewhere down the road. I don't understand those 4 months of how we can make a timeline and then we can get away from it. Gentlemen, it's just a couple of quick for you. From the beginning of Afghanistan 20 years ago, can you tell me what time of the year the Taliban traditionally counter-attacked our forces?
There is the summer fighting season, which typically starts in the spring. They plan throughout the winter. They build up supplies and those kinds of things. It typically starts in April, May, and runs till the fall. But that's not to suggest that there isn't fighting during the winter. It does subside a little bit, but given the mountain passes and the snow and the challenges with moving about, that's typically why the fighting does subside a little bit in the wintertime.
So it wouldn't surprise you that any of our guys would say, listen, we're going to have more fighting in the summer, right? Because of the heavy snows. So why didn't we reduce our presence in the fall and the winter when the weather was worse? I'm ask both of you real quick. I know my time is up. Why wouldn't we have that in that time of year other than the time of the year when they were ready to fight? They were all away from home, congregating, ready to do whatever they needed to do to fight and take over Afghanistan. Why would we not do it? Was there any talk, Dr. Call? Let's go with you first.
Well, the timeline for the departure was set in April.
I know that.
So I can't, and I wasn't part of those deliberations, so it's not a satisfying answer for you, Senator, but I don't know the rationale beyond that. The president calculated that the longer we stayed beyond the deadline established by the Doha Agreement, the higher at risk our forces would be.
Yeah. General, was there any military talk on that you can remember?
So there was, and as you know, as the chairman, General Miller and General McKenzie, I was not present with their personal recommendations, but as they testified, their personal feelings is that the 2,500 should have stayed and it should have become a conditions-based withdrawal. But as Dr. Call pointed out, I think what the president was wrestling with was the 1 May and which was extended towards the end of the summer kind of deadline and the potential for the recommencing of hostilities with the Taliban had we stayed any longer than. I think that was the strategic dilemma.
Thank you both for your service and time. I apologize, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tuberville. The committee will stand in recess and reconvene in SCC 217 at 2:15 for a closed session. Excuse me? 12:15. I've been corrected. appropriately. So the committee will stand in recess.